Welcome back to Modern Political Thought. This is our second session with Machiavelli. This time we're reading the Discourses on Livy. Yesterday we spent time with Il Principe, the Prince. And if you recall, in the first chapter of the book, he says that all states, that is, all political communities, political governments and regimes can be classified into two political forms. One is principality or monarchy, that is, a state that is ruled by one person, and the other is a republic. And in the second chapter, he says that I'm going to leave the discussion about republics to a later book and only focus on principalities in this book. That later book happens to be the Discourses. Machiavelli spent most of his time actually writing about the Discourses, which were published in 1531, again, posthumously. This is, in a way, his more important work. And this book is a series of 3 long discourses on the first 10 books of Livy. Before I turn to Livy and his work, let me just say something about what Machiavelli is trying to do. This is, again, similar to his ambition in Il Principe. Machiavelli says in the preface to this book, the preface to the published edition, he says this, he's somewhat saddened and amazed by the fact that people's, in his time, relationship to history. People either view history as something that is a cultural artifact, something that they can be simply entertained by looking back, or that they view history as something that is so far removed that it has no relevance for the present. And he says that this is incorrect. He says that history, in fact, has a lot to teach us. And specifically, history has things to teach us about politics. So reading from the preface, he says, nevertheless, in organizing republics, maintaining states, governing kingdoms, in instituting a militia and administering a war, in executing legal decisions among subjects, and in expanding an empire, no prince, republic, military leader, or citizen can be found to have recourse to the examples of the ancients. I am persuaded that this arises from not possessing a true understanding of histories. So, he says, wishing then to extricate men from this error, I have deemed it necessary to write about all those books by Livy that have not been taken from us by the hostility of time, what, according to my understanding of ancient and modern affairs, I judge necessary for a greater understanding of them, so that those who will read these discourses of mine may more easily derive from them that practical knowledge one must seek from a familiarity with the histories. Again, this book is aimed as a kind of practical guide or manual for those who are interested in doing politics, but specifically those who are committed to republics, to the republican form of government. Machiavelli himself is sympathetic to the republican form of government. We'll discuss what that means, but that is in line with his kind of intellectual project as a whole. So before we get to the book and the core of the argument, let me say a few words about Livius. Titus Livius, or Livy, was a Roman historian who grew up in the time of Augustus. This is towards the end of the Republic. And he was a prolific chronicler of Roman history. He wrote many, many volumes, but only a few of them survived. These were mostly written in Latin, and for a long period in Europe, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, these books were kind of forgotten. They were recuperated in the period of the Renaissance, and they became very popular. Of the books that did survive, they tell us about the history of the founding of Rome, the myth of Romulus and Remus, all the way through the expansion of the Republic and the conquering of most of Italy. So Livy himself wrote a book which was very moralistic. Wrote his books in a kind of moralistic flavor. That is, he's trying to discern from these historical events distinctions between the good and the bad, the good and evil. Machiavelli's attempt is to return to the history, but not judge them according to moral or ethical criteria again, but to judge them from a purely political standpoint. That is, he's interested, as I said last time, in the effectual truth of human action. So it begins with the premise that humans, unlike, not as gods and not as destined by fate, have abilities, that they are able to use their capacities, their emotions, their courage, their reason, rationality, and they can produce and create something. And the politics, in the domain of politics, what is important is precisely the effectuality of human action. So he's interested in how we can derive lessons about politics, specifically pertaining to the Republic, from these books of Livy. So this raises the question, why study the books of Livy? Well, the obvious fact is that the books of Livy, the subject, the very subject, the protagonist, if you will, of his historical narrative, is the Roman Republic. It is not a human being. It is the Roman Republic itself, a particular political regime that is the subject of Livy's histories. And this Roman Republic, it is important to note, lasts a very, very long time, 500 years, from 509 BC to about 27 BC, five centuries. The American Republic, for example, has lasted only 200 years by comparison. So it is a very enduring political regime, something that is very big. It starts out as a city, but becomes a huge empire and very, very powerful. So Machiavelli has a clear preference, political preference, for the Republican form of government. And since his own experience as a statesman in the Florentine Republic, he learned that the Florentine Republic was very fragile. It was soon defeated, and it did not last long. So he's trying to think about the ways in which a political regime for the Republic can become institutionally robust and strong, and can defend itself, and can become long-lasting and is stable. So that is why he returns to the example of Rome. He's interested in Rome because Rome is the key example from which he can learn. So turning to the book itself has three discourses, three parts. The first one pertains to the founding of a new state. It deals with the foundations. The second is about the expansion of the new state. And the third is about leadership and renewing. We are only reading a few chapters from part 1 and part 3, but which are sufficient to give us a kind of understanding of Machiavelli's political theory and conception of republics. What is, again, important to note is that this book too begins with a dedication. Il Principe begins with a dedication to Lorenzo de' Medici. It is about praising the new prince for creating a new state, and it is trying to offer him a gift. This book has a different kind of dedication. It is to two of his friends, Zanobi and Cosimo. And if you read the dedication carefully, he says that this book is meant for friends and meant for the people as a whole. So he's already marking in this dedication a contrast with the prince. The prince is a gift to somebody who has power. This book is a lesson to friends and the common people who might be able to learn from this text and work towards creating a durable and long-lasting republic. Now, his key concern, again, this is animated by the kind of understanding of politics he has that he developed in Il Principe, that has to do with this interplay between fortune and virtue. But it also deals with other sets of concepts and concerns that are specific to the Republican form of political regimes, which are freedom and conflict. And we'll see what these mean in time. He begins the book by identifying two different ways in which republics are founded. One is by the people themselves, people living in a particular state or city or region organize themselves into republics. They create a political community in order to defend themselves. Or second, it could be through foreign conquest. The example he gives, for example, is Alexandria, where Alexander conquered parts of Egypt and established a republican laws and rules in that region. So the republic as a political form, he's not using that term to mean something that is a good kind of regime by default. What he means is that a political regime cannot be good in abstract terms, because a lot depends on history or context, and even the capacities and cultural memories of the people who live in those states. So, given a particular fortuna, the question is, in what ways can republics achieve greatness and strive? But let's first try to deal with the major issue, which is what is a republic? How do we define republics? Republican and republic is oftentimes used in contemporary sense. And today, if we were to ask you what you mean by republican or republic, with republican, you would probably refer to one of the political parties of the United States. This is not at all what we mean by republican here. This is not at all what Machiavelli means by republican. And by republic, typically, people would say a certain kind of representative democracy, where people elect representatives who in the House, in the Parliament or the Senate, make laws and decisions on their behalf. To use Lincoln's phrase, a government by the people, of the people, and for the people, right? But this is, again, not what Machiavelli means by a republic. In the classical period, here we go back to Plato, Aristotle, and even Cicero, there is a certain conception about the types of regimes that exist. There's, of course, monarchy or principality. This is what Machiavelli calls principality. It's the rule by one person. That's a regime that is characterized by the rule by one. Then is an aristocracy that is a rule by the few. Numerically, they are few, but they somehow possess the requisite capacities and virtues in order to be able to rule. And then democracy is often the rule by the many. That is, most of the people have a say in determining the political laws and rules of the state. Now, in all of these three major types, there is often a concern with their stability, that these forms typically degenerate into bad kinds of political regimes. Monarchy, because the monarch becomes so enthralled by their own power and their lack of competition for power, becomes tyrannical and oppressive towards the people. An aristocracy, which is again ruled by very few people, typically, in order to preserve their own interests, devolves into and degenerates into a rule by the oligarchs or oligarchy, that is, by the few who are typically wealthy. And then democracy, again, typically degenerates into a certain kind of mob rule where one good rhetorician or performer can come and affectively charge the masses, manipulate the masses through speech, and get them to do things that are contrary to their interests. So these three major classical forms of government, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, are all unstable and have internal tendencies and dynamics towards degeneration into three of the bad forms: tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule. So the republic was conceived of by Aristotle and Cicero as a certain kind of mixed constitution. So a republic is a mixed regime. It is a mixed regime that combines elements from monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, and uses a combination of these three basic forms of government in order to make something that is more stable. In order to make something that is more stable, because it is able to allow for the interests of different groups to be discussed and be openly deliberated. So it contains, for example, monarchical elements, typically a consul or a president or executive authority. It would also concern an aristocratic element, a senate, that is, people with higher education or capacities or wealth. And it would also have assemblies or democratic element where people would come together who are excluded from the Senate and the office of the consul to deliberate on things and then influence political decisions. So a government of the Republican form takes elements of all three classical forms of government forms in the hope that these three forms will check each other and would not let any one element become the dominant element. underlying this conception of politics is a sense that these different regimes actually represent the interests of different kinds of social classes. In Rome, for example, Roman society was classically divided into two groups: the patricians, what we can call the elites, and the plebeians, or the masses. The patricians typically had access to senatorial powers, that is, only patricians, that is, people with property, could hold office in the Senate, and the plebeians were often left out of politics. But the success of the Roman Republic for Machiavelli is precisely that the plebeians became organized and made claims for political participation. They created assemblies, and they created the institution of the tribunates, or the tribunals, where a plebeian tribune, could veto decisions made by the Senate and represent the interests of the plebeians. So why does Machiavelli prefer the republican form of government? It is because it integrates the whole of the political community. The different social classes and the different institutions that represent their interests all exist together and allow for an institutionalized way in which their interests are mediated and compete with each other, so that no one group can come to dominate the outcomes in a political society. So what are the underlying principles of this republican form of government? As I already said, republic, the notion comes from Latin res publica, that is the whole, the public, for the public. And its underlying value is a certain kind of conception of freedom. Freedom both in the sense that a community will defend itself, it'll band together, come together in order to defend and ward off foreign invasions, but also it is internally free in that all groups are represented. All groups are able to secure for themselves ways in which their interests are not trampled upon, that no one group is dominated by another group. So Machiavelli has a clear preference for this form of government. This then brings us to two new concepts in Machiavelli's conception of politics. We've encountered that with principality, the three major concepts were glory, that have to do with transcending human limitations and become eternal, become part of the eternal, become part of historical memory, be immortalized. And then this interplay between fortune and virtues, that is your ability to create effectual truth, to dominate reality and maneuver and manipulate the given circumstances using your own human capacities in order to shape outcomes that allow you to attain glory. To this list of concepts, when discussing the Republic, two new concepts have to be introduced, and they are, as I've said already, freedom, but also conflict. And we'll try to unpack what the relationship is between the two. Again, in the classical period, specifically in the Roman period, Cicero, who was one of the major political philosophers, often would argue against conflict. In fact, Cicero is somebody who defended the republican form of government, and he said that the republican form of government is successful precisely because it avoids division and factions. Factions are groups that are only trying to fight for their own interests. And he says a republican form of government is one that allows people to have a view of the whole community and everybody who's in that community, in that political community. Machiavelli's response to this is different. Again, like a realist, as somebody who's trying to understand the real mechanisms and motives of politics, he's trying to attack this particular conception and view. He does not subscribe to the view that republic is about consensus and peace and harmony. In fact, he says, this is on chapter 4, I cannot deny that fortune and their military were reasons for Roman dominance, but it seems clear to me that these thinkers fail to realize where there is good military organizations, there must also be good institutions. And only rarely does this occur where there is not also good fortune. But let us move to other details concerning the city. I must say that it appears to me that those who condemn the disturbances between the nobles and the plebeians, that is, the patricians and the plebeians, condemn those very things that were the primary cause of Roman liberty, and that they give more consideration to the noises and cries arising from such disturbances than to the good effects they produced. Nor do they consider that in every republic there are two different tendencies, that of the people and that of the upper class, and that all of the laws which are passed in favor of liberty are born from the rift between the two, as can easily be seen from what happened in Rome. Since from the time of the Tarquins to that of the Gracchi, a period of more than 300 years, the disturbances in Rome rarely led to exile and even more rarely to bloodshed. It is not possible, therefore, to judge these disturbances to be harmful or such a republic to be divided, since over such a long period of time, its strife sent no more than 8 or 10 citizens into exile, killed very few of them, and condemned not many more to pay fines. Nor can one in any way reasonably call a republic disorganized, where so many examples of exceptional ability occur. For good examples arise from good training from good laws, and good laws from those disturbances that many people thoughtlessly condemn. And anyone who carefully examines the goal of these laws will find that they did not lead to exile or to violence against the common good, but instead brought forth laws and institutions for the benefit of civic liberty. So the argument he's making is precisely to attack people like Cicero. In fact, he names Cicero towards the bottom of that passage explicitly. And he's saying that they do not grasp the effectual truth. Ultimately, what is of interest is that conflict and political divisions, what effect they have. That is the only way in which you would want to judge them. This, again, is in line and consistent with his conception of politics in the Prince. That is, you judge politics by the results. The question is not that conflict is universally good or that conflict is universally bad. You have to look at the role that conflict plays, the effect it has. And more than that, if there exist good institutions, that is, if there are good ways in which the conflict and divisions can be channeled institutionally, then conflicts actually can be very, very useful to maintenance of liberty. So freedom, again, in the Republican sense, which means that all social groups in a particular political community are represented and can defend their interests, and no one group dominates the rest. This involves precisely the existence of institutional mechanisms that allow for conflicts to occur without them devolving into forms of violence. So it is not about partisan lawmaking, non-partisan lawmaking about conflict. So you need to have institutions that allow for conflicts to take place. Rome, where there are these two different classes, the few who are rich and the poor, the plebeians, the poor want to be free from the oppression by the rich. And the rich obviously want to preserve their own interests. So the poor have to organize themselves into assemblies and pose a threat to the power of the few. If not, they will lose, they will be oppressed, and the republic will be lost. It will disintegrate into a rule by the oligarchs. So conflict, if you are disempowered in political life, you must strive to generate conflict. So the whole architecture of the Roman politics, Republican politics, is that it counters power by power. If you are weak, you need to become strong. If you want to, and this is something that is true and applies obviously even to the present context. What is a social movement? A social movement precisely is a certain kind of demonstration of Republican virtue. That is, people or groups that are disempowered mobilize themselves, organize themselves, and pose a threat to the established regime, to the established groups that are in positions of political power. So political freedom is precisely this ability to represent your own interests and fight against political domination. And the Republican form is particularly suited because it creates the institutional mechanisms through which all interests of all different social groups are taken into account. So politics is not about harmony or unity, but it is about disorder and contestation and division, so long as those are well institutionalized. So this disharmony and this conflict, this is the paradoxical and dialectical argument that Machiavelli is making. He's saying that the stability and durability of republics, the fact that they are stable and are able to defend themselves and do not disintegrate into bad forms of government, is precisely the fact that it allows for a certain kind of conflict to take place. You want to push for the interest of your group, and only once you make a claim, that once you defend your own interests, that you get a seat at the table and you become a party to compromise. You cannot arbitrarily, just before you face the political situation, come to the table and have a discussion about what kind of ideal regime there is. It's only when you are faced with the circumstances where you realize that you're disempowered, you organize yourself, you make a claim, and only then, when you pose a threat to the established configurations of power, that you are able to arrive at a new kind of compromise. So political conflict allows for, it is only through political conflict and division that you can arrive at an aggregation of interests and the view of the whole, without which you're not going to get there. His concern, Machiavelli's concern in the Discourses, is to think about a politics of a republican kind which lasts long. And in order to last long, what it has to do is to allow for conflict to take place, for disunity and divisions to take place. That will only then will it allow and secure the conditions for freedom and durability, both of which are his main concerns. Durability in the sense that it does not disintegrate into bad forms of government, but also durability in that when it comes to foreign invasion or threats from abroad, that the republic can actually come together. Because even if you're fighting amongst yourselves, if you have an institutional system where everybody has a stake, everybody participates, then they would come together and be able to defend themselves because they view themselves as part of a larger political community. This also leads to some other interesting commentaries on things like religion. Machiavelli has a kind of paradoxical relationship to religion, because in a way, he is not a fan of the Roman Catholic Church and the domination that it has in organizing religious life, but he's still impressed by the role that pagan religions did play in the Roman Republic. Having a religion, what it does is that it allows for a certain kind of cultural integration of people. Again, religion by itself is not a good or bad thing for Machiavelli. The concern is whether or not it is effectual in maintaining the republic. What does a religion do? A religion that is located within the city, not one which is coming, not the commands, moral commands that emanate out of a church somewhere else in the world. A religion allows for a certain kind of spirit of cultural integration, which makes people think of themselves as part of something bigger, right? So they're willing to sacrifice themselves for a larger cause. A famous story, of course, of the Roman Republic is Horatius, the military commander who fights against an invading army, sacrifices himself so that the bridge to Rome can be burnt, so that the army cannot reach Rome, right? So religion not only allows people to see that they're part of something bigger, but it also imposes a certain kind of discipline. It morally regulates behavior. This discipline is important because it actually involves the training of citizens. What it means to be a citizen, after all, the concept again is another important one. To be a citizen means that you view yourself as part of a larger political community. And having a religion in a particular political community means that it disciplines you and morally regulates your behavior, which prevents you from being oppressed by individuals who are ambitious for political power. The Romans, for example, had the institution of the dictatorship. Whenever a foreign army or some kind of crisis situation occurred, the three bodies, the institutions of the republic, the consuls, the senates, and the assemblies would get together and elect a dictator. The consuls were typically the monarchical element of the republic, and they would choose one dictator who will have complete authority over all matters, all political matters in Rome. until the crisis was resolved. Now, if you are an politically ambitious person, you could really manipulate this institution of the dictatorship, of the dictator. But if you have a vigilant citizenship body, if you have a vigilant political community who are, again, morally regulated, who are disciplined, then you're much less likely to get away with something like that. So religion plays an important role in that it prevents a certain kind of corruption. This is, again, an important discussion that he has. Corrupted people, corrupted political communities are those that become stagnant. Those that become stagnant because they lose their agility, political agility. So if you have a political regime that is ruled only by one person, or let's say a group of few people, and the rest of the political community is disenfranchised, and they are not empowered, then those in power become much more comfortable with their power because they don't see any kind of serious threat to their power. There's no conflict in that political system. So they become decadent. They indulge in things that have nothing to do with maintaining political power, and they become more susceptible and vulnerable to invasions and revolutions, foreign domination, and civil war. So the lack of conflict, the lack of political activism of different centers of society that shake things up and generate new configurations of power sharing and compromise also prevent the corruption of people. So religion is also important in generating a certain kind of political activism, in moral integration of social groups together. So again, the concern that Machiavelli has is that religion can play a productive role in shaping and integrating and allowing for republics to stabilize themselves. Religions also play another important role, which is it creates certain kinds of myths. So what religion allows you to do is it makes you feel like you're part of a community that has a mythical origin and also has a certain kind of prophetic destiny. Again, this gives you the sense of belonging to some higher cause and greater purpose. So this is another key dimension of what makes a good regime. But ultimately, his main concern with the Republican form of government, and I will now conclude, is that it's the form of government that would allow for the greatest freedom, and greater freedom because it allows for a certain kind of institutionalized conflict and division, but also one that paradoxically allows people to come together and really imagine themselves to be a part of political community. That is, to take responsibility for the shared political community. And this is a kind of political regime that is more durable, more stable, and ultimately also more capable of being glorious, like the Roman Republic. And Machiavelli, in the Discourses, is aspiring for Italy, more generally, but also Florence, to embark on a trajectory and political journey that allows it to achieve that kind of greatness, stability, and durability. So that's Machiavelli. I hope the two lecture recordings were somewhat useful. We will now move on to another major thinker, Thomas Hobbes, starting with the Leviathan, and we'll spend 2 days with the Leviathan.